Welcome to another episode of Progress, Potential, and Possibilities, discussions with fascinating people designing a better tomorrow for all of us. I'm your host, Ira Pastor.
Welcome, everybody, again to another episode of our show. Today, bringing you another really fascinating guest involved in creating a better tomorrow for all of us. Today, we have the honor of being joined by Dr. Joshua Tewksbury, who is the Ira Rubinoff Director of the Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute. He oversees more than 400 employees with an annual budget of $35 million, headquartered in Panama City, Panama, with field sites around the world. The STRI furthers the understanding and public awareness of tropical biodiversity and its importance to human welfare. And in addition to its resident scientists and support staff, STRI's facilities are used annually by some 1,400 visiting scientists, pre- and postdoctoral fellows, and interns from around the world. Dr. Tewksbury is an ecologist with more than 2 decades of research in conservation and biodiversity, as well as nearly a decade of executive leadership experience at international research institutes. Prior to this role at the Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute, Dr. Tewksbury was serving as the executive director at Future Earth, which is a global research and development program dedicated to sustainability and global change, where he led a network of literally tens of thousands of scientists, managed a wide range of conservation research projects, staff program, and partnerships. Dr. Tewksbury is also the co-founder and executive editor of Anthropocene Magazine, publication that highlights sustainability solutions. He holds faculty positions at University of Colorado Boulder, Colorado State, and George Mason University's Department of Environmental Science and Policy. He also has an appointment as senior scholar with Colorado State University School of Global Environmental Sustainability, and is a member of the National Academy of Sciences Board on Environmental Studies and Toxicology. And over the course of his career, Dr. Tewksbury has published close to 100 scientific papers on a range of topics, including conservation, climate change, natural history. He has a bachelor's degree in the field of biology from Prescott College, his doctorate from University of Montana in organismal biology and ecology. A lot of really exciting and interesting themes to get into today. We're honored to have him with us. Dr. Joshua Tewksbury, thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show.
It's absolutely my pleasure.
It's great having you, Josh. I would love to start off by hearing a little bit about sort of your early journey, your background, and if you could take us, I guess, a little bit up to around the year 2000, because I took a look at your PhD, breeding biology of birds in a Western riparian forest from demography to behavior, and there, you spent time, literally, years out in the wilderness, looking at hundreds of locations and thousands of species of birds and nests. Take us a little into those days and what got you started on this fascinating path.
I got into biology because I cared about the world, and I thought that understanding it was a good way to make my career align with my interest in the preservation of the planet and some sort of cohabitation of humans with the millions or billions of other species that live here. And I still believe that. But one of the things that happens when you go deep into biology is you get excited about the questions, right? Yeah. So, I started with, looking at fairly applied questions on how landscapes can support, healthy bird populations. And I, moved from that into understanding how, at first, how we can support native plant populations in Sonora, in the deserts of Sonora and northern Mexico. And that focused on wild crop relatives of one of our favorite plant species, the chilies, chili peppers. And, pretty soon that led into a 10-year sort of odyssey of trying to understand how chili peppers are hot in the first place. And to me, that's how science works, right? You get excited about questions and you follow your nose down pathways that others haven't explored, and you build a better understanding of the world in that process. And I love that work. I have a huge reverence for those who spend their entire career focused on understanding parts of the tangled bank that we haven't pulled apart yet, because in those tangled banks are solutions to some of our most challenging questions, but you don't know where, right? You don't know which part of the bank you need to work in. So I think that's a hugely important endeavor, and one, frankly, in which we support too little. That said, I also think there are questions that we need answers to today, right? And there are questions that we absolutely have to devote more time to. The urgency around finding solutions to major challenges in sustainability and our place on this planet grows every day. And scientists do have a responsibility to roll up their sleeves and support solutions with the science they can provide. And so I kind of got to a point, maybe midway through my academic career, where I wanted to pull back from my obsession with chili peppers and understand more deeply how I could have impact. Like basically ask the question of myself, like, okay, how would I direct my career to maximize the impact on the things I care most about? And I love chili peppers. I care a bunch about chili peppers, but fundamentally, if we don't figure out exactly why chili peppers are hot this year, that question is going to be around next year. And it's probably going to be around a decade from now. And meanwhile, we have some crises that we're dealing with around the world that are only tangentially related to why chili peppers are hot at best, right? They are much more, but there's huge amounts of science to do to help us find a sustainable path through these crises, these critical junctures, these crises, these tipping points in the Earth's biosphere, right? Whether that's the future of rainforests, or the understanding the future of biodiversity in a warming world, or understanding how we undergo an energy transition to get to a planet that is not so extractive, or a relationship to the planet that is not nearly as extractive as the one we're in now, how we wean ourselves of fossil fuels, like all sorts of really big challenges for society that involve a lot of science, right? There's not going to get through it without really understanding how things work. And so how do I position myself to help support that work? And so that was kind of a pivot for me.
And as you're you're studying these different themes, and whether it was the birds and the fact that, hey, if we mess with these trees over here, that there'd be more predation over here, and that's going to mess with the eggs and all that bit. I won't go too deep into what you were getting into in the PhD, but equally fascinating the chili pepper research, and how these secondary molecules communicate and defend and attract and are, again, part of this whole system of communication, whether we're talking at the micro or the macro level. These themes of fragmentation / connectivity come back over and over again through your publication path. Introduce us a little bit to those two themes, if you would.
Sure. I mean, I guess at the broadest level, many of the species that live on this earth require more land than sometimes we're willing to give them. And if we're smart about it, we can figure out how to support wildlife and support human development at the same time. And that doesn't come without thought and careful planning, because it's not so simple as just preserving large chunks of land around the world. We have, a population that is increasingly making that difficult, and we also know that not all land is equal when it comes to preserving animal biodiversity, right? And so part of the fundamental question is, how do you make the best land use choices you can to support wildlife populations while allowing human development, and not just allowing, but really creating a sustainable human world that we actually want to live in, one that is animal rich, one that has many cohabitants, and we are, embedded in and supportive of natural systems that in turn support our own existence, right? So that broad challenge takes a lot of forms, but one of them is understanding how to keep populations connected, because at the fundamental level, the ability of a species to survive is dependent on numbers of individuals within that species that can breed together, and that those form populations. And if you fragment those populations into smaller and smaller units, the chances of them surviving declines. And so it seems fairly obvious, but it takes careful planning to figure out how do you create literally win-win solutions in which we can do what we need to do for ourselves, let's say, for example, agriculture, while also supporting plant and animal populations to be connected and support a diverse landscape, and also do that in a way that actually benefits farmers. So an example of that is prairie strips. Like there's 10% of every farm in the United States that actually loses money. Figure out that 10%, figure it out with smart agriculture, and then turn that into native landscape, and you've connected across the prairies. Once you've connected across the prairies, farmers make more money because they're no longer farming on land that loses money, and wildlife does better, right? That work actually came into law in some states because of the work on fragmentation and connectivity that I was honored to be a part of. I didn't lead much of it. It was a big team effort to figure out how do you connect the dots, right? And there's a whole community of people figuring this stuff out. There was a fairly robust debate at 20 years ago around the idea that we should preserve either single large or several small protected areas to protect species most effective, kind of a simplification of a more complex ecosystem of species with different needs. And what I think what we argued for, and I think has become more and more baked into policy, is that you are often left with connecting that which is possible. In other words, the academic debate about whether we preserve one large landscape or several small is rarely played out in the real world of policy. And what instead you're left with is, how do you make the best use of the land that is not yet converted into parking lots, cities, agriculture, other pieces of our own urban landscape or suburban landscape? And then if you were to convert a few pieces back into natural habitats, how would you maximize the value of that? Because it's expensive work, and there are lots of needs. And a lot of times the answer to that is connect what you have, right? Make sure that there's flow of genes, flow of individuals, flow of populations, so that species can evolve. And a great example of that is, we know that climate change is impacting species at different rates, and that one of the big ways in which species adapt is to move, right? Whether you move up a mountain, whether you move from sort of southern Mexico to northern Mexico to the US to Canada, all of those things go from a warmer to a cooler place. And the only way that many species are going to be able to do that is if we provide the connectivity that allows them to do that. And so that's one tool that creates resilience in natural systems, allows those species to persist through what is going to be a fairly tough bottleneck, even if we're really good at curbing our use of fossil fuels, because much of the climate warming is baked in. Whether we hit 1.5 degrees or 2.5 degrees is a very big question. We'll have large consequences. Either way, it's going to be consequential for many, many species.
And continuing on from that, because I think it feeds really nicely into your 2014 science editorial, and this was entitled An Animal-Rich Future. You wrote this together with Dr. Rogers, now at Iowa State. And again, talking from the perspective, okay, we have these ecosystems, but hey, everything we're doing to them, this defaunation is happening. We're losing a lot. As the days go by, and this paper, interesting, it touches on sort of 3 points, and I'd love for you to go a little more into this within the context of what you were just talking about. One, that these themes of restoration, but also rewilding are important, and we need to do that. Two, that in doing this, we cannot focus on the ecosystem of 100 years ago. That isn't here anymore. We got to work within what we got today. And three, this interesting point about as we do all that, we can't give up on so-called difficult species. And I thought this was quite interesting. I had about 2 years ago, I had Dr. Thomas Hildebrand on from Leibniz, the Zoo and Wildlife. He's there trying to clone or get the northern white rhinos to mate and all that. We got two left, but we can't just focus on the easy stuff. There's important megafauna around that we got to make sure stay around. Walk through this paper, because I think this whole paper was fascinating, and again, all leads into what we're going to be talking about per Smithsonian.
Yeah, I think fundamentally, we have to get creative. We have to get creative because, and we have to, and that creativity and flexibility means that, a militant stance of attempting to recreate an Earth that existed 500 years ago is not going to be effective. It's not going to be, it's going to be divisive, and it's not going to lead to a future that we want for any of us. We have to figure out what the future looks like. And truthfully, there isn't a part of this planet that isn't already affected by humans. Like, there really is not. With climate change that we've caused, we're affecting all parts of the planet. So that's the world we live in, and it's the sort of hand we're given. So the question from that was posed in that paper, and that I still wrestle with, is, so what do you do about it, right? How do you build an animal-rich future, or a future that includes as many species as possible, that is good for humans at the same time? And in that, I think there's a couple of lessons. One, for example, and we touched on this in the paper. People in Europe and the US love to tell countries in Africa how to deal with their elephants.
Yeah.
That doesn't go over very well, right? Because we've wiped out our bison, and now we're telling other countries that they need to keep their elephants. It turns out bison are really hard for a growing economy. They trample things. So do elephants, right? And so they have real impact on the people that live with them. And as much as we love them, we need to work very consciously at creating structures that allow those countries to make decisions that are good for their economies, as well as good for their wildlife. It just won't hold without that. The fortress mentality is breaking down. We're not going to carve out areas of the world and say this is for elephants and all people must be removed from them. Not because it wouldn't be beautiful to have those places, but one, it's not ethical. Two, the people who live there don't necessarily want to do it that way. And three, it's just not feasible, right? We've got a lot more concerns to consider when we figure out what an animal-rich future looks like. And that also means our landscapes and our combinations of species in place will change. And when we wrote that paper, Haldra was working and is still working in the island of Guam. And the island of Guam is the only tropical rainforest in the world that has no birds. It has no birds. We were both working out there, but this is her project. It has no birds because a brown tree snake was released in the island of Guam, and it ate all the birds, literally all of the birds on the island. So it's a large-scale, massive defaunation event. And it asks the question, what happens to a forest that is silent, right? What happens to a forest that has no birds? And a lot of things happen to that ecosystem. And yet, when we consider how we support Guam as an island, we're not trying to recreate Guam before the US Army dropped the tree snake off there. We can't. We can't get rid of all the tree snakes on Guam. They're stuck in the karst, right? So what does an animal-rich future look like on that island, right? How do you build a bird population back up there that is actually resistant to the snakes that are on the island, right? Because now the island is, we're not thinking about these trade-offs, how we build a novel ecosystem that is productive, that is serving the functions that an ecosystem provides, controlling insect abundance, reducing pest pressures, propagating trees. All of these things are things that birds do. How do you make that possible? Recognizing that you're not actually going to go back to the pre-snake Guam in any foreseeable future that we can find today. Not that it wouldn't be awesome. And there are cases where we can remove invasive species from islands, and we have done that successfully. More often with mammals. Rats is a good example, and it has huge impact. So I'm not at all against removing invasive species, but I want to be practical about where we can get it done and how we create ecosystems that make sense for the future. The other piece on that, of course, is that those novel ecosystems are not always particularly bad. there are cases all over the world where invasive species have been integrated into native ecosystems and have not caused massive harm. And of course, that is not to say that some do. Some cause irrevocable harm to ecosystems. Lionfish are a great example, right? And here in the tropical Caribbean, very concerned about what should happen if they were to get across the Panama Canal, for example. So we want to do everything we can to reduce invasions. It's also true that in some places, lionfish, outside of their native range, are able to coexist. So we got to figure out these systems and work with them, rather than just have a blanket solution that we're going to remove all invasive species. The truth is that we move species around the planet all the time, and that's not likely to stop. And the best time to stop an invasive species is before it happens, and the second best time is yesterday, because it gets harder every day to stop something from taking a foothold. So there's processes we can put in place and rules, but once you do have a novel ecosystem developed, Hawaii is a great example. Many island ecosystems, particularly in the tropics, have an interesting mix of both native and some non-native species. We then have to sort of build out processes to support native biodiversity that are more creative, perhaps, than we might have used in the past, right? A good example, there's plenty of good examples on Hawaii. I would say, for example, avian malaria is a huge problem, right? And it's wiping out bird species, and we got to figure out how to use novel techniques and synthetic biology, for example, to figure out how you would kill off avian malaria in a place like that we might not consider otherwise, that we couldn't have done 20 years ago. And then I guess finally, not giving up on the difficult stuff. I think that's absolutely correct. But if you're able to rescue the white rhino, which we should do everything we can to do, we also have to recognize that the white rhino will not be living in the range it was living in when more humans were in its range. It's going to be a different species in a different place, adapting to different environments, and that's okay. Right? That's part of the future we're trying to build. Is not throw out a lot of the parts that biodiversity represents, and minimize the decline in species diversity. And I guess the last thing to say is you started with this, right? The decline in species diversity is just massive. We are in an extinction crisis that is not a slow crisis. It's only slow because of our perception of time, right? I mean, there are a few extinction crises in the past that are slightly faster. There are others that have happened even at slower rates because of the rate of change in systems. But this one is certainly going to rank right up there with the Paleocene, Eocene thermal maximum, where you had a lot of warming 55 million years ago. That was an extinction crisis that was huge. It took 20,000 years to play out, right? Even on the extinction side of it, we're doing that in 150, right? This is a fast decline of species diversity on the planet. And if you talk to paleoecologists, biodiversity will recover. Give it 10 million years. But the species that we care about won't. The species that we interact with, the species that much of our culture is based on around the world, the myths, the stories, the fact that these species are critical for the food that we eat, not just our nutrition but our security. I mean, one way to think about the reasons why we need to think creatively about an animal and a plant-rich future is just our agricultural systems, right? Our agricultural systems are based on very few species, and the history of agriculture is domestication and then moving that crop species to a place that outruns its pests. And the history of agriculture is that those pests always catch up. And then we have outbreaks and famines and huge impacts on our systems. And that's happened over and over again, whether it's the Irish potato famine or what you see with insects in African staple crops as well. And part of that problem is that we use very few species and we don't plan for the future, right? We don't build a catalog of the predators or the pests of the crops that we use in their native range so that we can predict what's likely to happen when eventually those predators and pests catch up, because they will. Because we move around the world too much not to let that happen over time. And so our lack of predictive capacity in understanding the future of the world bites us all the time. And it's a complex world we're dealing with. And yet that complex world interacting with our massively simplified agricultural system, for example, in which we depend on 7 or 8 staple crops and we grow them in monoculture, that interacts sometimes in disastrous ways. And those disasters are, at this point, fully preventable because we do understand the systems and the consequences. We just haven't invested in the fundamental understanding of the natural history of the crops we depend on. It's kind of crazy. It's kind of like building an airplane or a spaceship out of a material you decided not to stress test. Right? Like no one would do that, except we do that all the time in our agricultural systems, right? So I think this is why that fundamental natural history knowledge is so important. We need to understand how species interact, not just because we think it's cool, but because it's sort of vital to our ability to make sure we're feeding all of us on this planet, to make sure that the future of this world is not just for those that are protected by high incomes, right? But is for everyone. It's that kind of reality that gets me up in the morning to say, okay, like, what's the job today? Like, how do you have impact today?
Excellent. So yeah, let's move on to STRI, and I'm sitting here on the U.S. East Coast in Philadelphia, and I drive 2 hours that way. I get to DC, and I'm at the Smithsonian's DC main camp, or whatever you want to call it. I was not aware, and maybe I'm admitting my ignorance here, of STRI at the time. But clearly, you've been around 100 years now. I think this is your 100th anniversary this year, and you've really built an amazing living laboratory where you have tropical rainforests and marine ecosystems and all sorts of other neat biodiversity happening in this really unique geographic area. Take us a little into the history, Josh, about STRI, its relationship, how you work with the folks down the road here. Walk us through a bit of that, if you would.
Well, the history of science is also the history of nations, right? So the fundamentals of why the Smithsonian has one large, long-term unit outside of the United States is also the history of the country itself, the history of Panama and the Panama Canal. So, new country is formed, 1910, that area, a little bit before. They turned to the United States to say, well, we would like to understand what the biodiversity is in this area around the canal, and even in the new country that was formed. What is here? And at that time, in the early 1900s, when you went to the United States for science, the only thing you would go to is the Smithsonian, because the Smithsonian was the first big bet that the U.S. made on science. And I think a lot of people don't recognize, the fact that the Smithsonian is, by dollars, it's more science than museums, but people see the museums, and so they're deeply connected to it, and they're a fantastic part of what Smithsonian does. But it's also a research institution, right. And it started in Panama because the country of Panama, the newly formed country, asked for support and assistance in understanding what was there. And the work was started on a hilltop that was rapidly turned into an island by the filling of the Panama Canal. And that was Barrow, Colorado Island. And that happened, we built a field station there in 1923. We actually started research there in 1910 as the canal was filling, which finished filling in 1914. And then, as Panama, built its own independent structures, as the canal itself became both contentious in terms of how it was apportioned, who had rights and sovereignty within that canal zone, and as it became more of a political football for the United States and was eventually given back to Panama, the Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute endured, and it is, I think, really safe to say that we are the most stable part of the U.S.-Panamanian relationship. Like, there have been ups and downs, significant ups and downs in the political history of the U.S. and Panama. But throughout all of that, STRI has been doing science and supporting, and been well supported by both countries. Even during the invasion, when the U.S. invaded Panama, and Noriega was the dictator of Panama, we were still doing research, and we had people having firefights underneath our buildings, and the research continued. So. And today, now we are much bigger than at that point, and largely because of the support of the Panamanian governments, successive governments, and recognizing that as the canal zone expanded and there was a lot more space for Panamanian innovation and science and other aspects, STRI expanded to 13 facilities all over Panama, and now supports, is the largest tropical science research institute in the world, building building connections across the world for individuals interested in understanding the most complex ecosystems of the world, right, in the tropics. So that's our mission. We're based in Panama, but we're very much focused on the future and the past of tropical countries around the world. Those 101 nations that collectively, encompass 80% of the biodiversity and also have about 1/100th the science capacity as a nation like the United States or Switzerland or the UK. We won't live in a sustainable world. We won't get to it unless we change that inequity, right? Unless we have science capacity in all countries. And I think a big part of our mission is to support next generation leaders from around the world in the tropics to be experts of the tropics in their home countries, right? Because that's good for the US and it's good for the world and it's good for those countries. Like this is a collaborative venture. One other way of saying, STRI, the Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute, is probably among the longest and largest STRI is most likely among the longest standing and largest U.S. science diplomacy missions ever. We've been doing this for longer and more consistently than almost any other science diplomacy mission around the world. I've been trying to find someone to tell me I'm wrong on that, because I have a sneaking suspicion there's probably some telescope or other physics experiment that we've been engaged in longer, but nothing that's so clearly a U.S. institution on foreign soil that is very much a collaboration with that country, focused explicitly on discovery and diffusion of knowledge. Like that's what we do, right? So it's a unique space. There's nothing quite like it in the world, and I'm really honored to be a part of it.
Yeah, it's really exciting, and just hearing you talk about it, and again the long history of, as you're saying, science diplomacy, which has been another important topic for us. So that's nice to hear. So Josh, if here I am, I'm a pre or postdoc researcher. I'm interested in coming down to Panama and studying either the effects of ocean acidification on dopamine-mediated behavioral responses of a coral reef damselfish, or the wildlife gut microbiomes of sympatric generalist species responding differently to anthropogenic landscape disturbances, or other really cool topics like this. How does that all work? How do I to hook up with STRI? What is the typical process like? How long do I get to hang out? Is there a limit on how long I can stay in Panama to do my research? What's the whole process behind?
Yeah, it's a great question. So STRI support runs about 70 to 80% of all the scientific permits in Panama. We support people from all over the world to do research here. And if anyone's done international research, you got to do that based on the rules and laws of the country you're working in. And there's everything from export permits to import permits to visas to how long you can stay. So we manage that for folks coming to Panama, and we work very closely with the Panamanian government to make that happen. So doing tropical research with us is just easier because we have the facilities to support research. We have 13 field facilities, lab facilities. We have construction cranes built in the rainforest to get people to the top of canopy trees to do research on physiology. We've got cutting edge microscopy labs or labs working on genomics and genetics that you can do cutting edge science and then walk out your door to your study samples, right? So a lot of what I think makes STRI unique is that we can rewild the science, right? We can take the really important science that needs to be done and put it in the context in which evolution and ecology happens. And then we can apply that to critical questions affecting tropical countries around the world. Like, how do you reforest a tropical forest with the species that are already there, rather than bringing in teak or eucalyptus? How do you do that in a way that respects the people who live on the land? Or how do you rebuild a coral reef? Because we will need to. Right? Not because we want to, but because that is going to be a part of our future. That will be a prime example of a novel ecosystem as we go forward. And so there's a ton of science to figure out how to do that. The best way to do that is where the reefs are, right? So there's only a few countries in the world that can do that, Australia being one of them, Panama being another. And so we need to work together to figure that stuff out, right? And so to answer your question about as a postdoctoral researcher or as a graduate student, each year we have hundreds of fellows, and we have a whole fellowship page where you can apply to everything from short-term fellowships that are a few months, so you come out for a summer during your graduate research or even your undergraduate research, We have dozens of universities that run their courses through us, everything from Yale to Harvard to Cambridge to McGill. So we work with a bunch of universities around the world who come and bring their students. And then at the graduate level and the postdoctoral level, we have built a wide range of opportunities, ranging from a few months to 3 to even 5-year postdocs, right, where you're coming down for long periods of time. We have a core group of about 35 what in a university you'd call professors. We call them staff scientists. They're all focused on tropical research, and all of those hundreds of fellows work in some way with our staff scientists. Now, many of them, if they're grad students or postdocs, also have mentors and labs in Germany or Switzerland or the US or Canada, and they come to do their field research, and they'll have a community in their home country and a community here that they're working between to do that work. We serve a lot of our demography for our visitors, about 1,400 scientists a year, is US, Latin America, and Europe for the most part, with increasing populations coming from Asia and Africa. But the dominant sort of community is about 40% from Latin American countries, about 40% from US, North American countries, and about 20% from Europe in any given time. And so if you go out to Barrow, Colorado Island, it's often thought of as the site of the longest running conversation in tropical biology, right? And it's a very international conversation. There'll be people studying and talking about the dynamics of the site of night flying bees and how to reverse engineer that for self-driving cars. And then at the same time, there'll be people trying to figure out how you track howler monkeys and understand social behavior of groups for our deep understanding of sociology, right? So very diverse topics that are studied with, sometimes really very, very technical instrumentation, right? So, for example, we are warming the forest floor under massive areas in the rainforest on Barrow, Colorado Island, so we can see the effects of climate change, so we can see how microbes do that. That's not something we do alone. We do that with fantastic researchers in the UK, that they come to do that. They come to us because we can do that, because we have the facilities to be able to do like large scale landscape electrician projects where we put coils underneath the forest, and we can maintain them for years. I think the sort of secret sauce of Smithsonian is we can do things longer and at larger scales than most institutions, because we're this combination of sort of long-term federal support for science and a platform for people to write grants from, to do very incisive work that require pulses of resources.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And talking about long and large timescales, it was just a couple weeks ago now that Smithsonian announced this $12 million grant from the Bezos Earth Fund, focused on, obviously you're sitting there in part of the lungs of the world, the study carbon sequestration, understanding all the dynamics, not just that rainforests are good at storing carbon, but some really interesting tools you're going to be integrating with all this, something known as geotrees and this Smithsonian Forest GEO network, and all satellites and lasers and all sorts of other cool things. Talk about this, if you would. This seems extremely fascinating. Obviously, an important, large-term project.
Yeah, no, this is a great example of where I think Smithsonian fits into the scientific sort of pantheon. Is sort of we started understanding tropical forests here in Panama. The first sort of systematic understanding. I mean, the questions that were first asked in the tropics are, how do you get so many species in one place, right? How do you get an island, that has, like country of Panama is like 3,000 tree species. It's the size of Ireland. Ireland has 30 tree species, right? So how does that happen, right? And those are the questions that dominated the early research at Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute. And we set up a system of large-scale plots, what we call 50-hectare plots, where we just tagged and identified and monitored the fate of every stem bigger than your pinky on that plot. In that case, 250,000 stems or more, where we've been tracking their fate for 50 years. And the reason you do that is, like, understanding the dynamics of forests takes time, right? Because they live a long time. And if you want to understand how so many species are maintained, you have to follow species for long periods of time. You have to follow seedlings, large individuals. How do trees die? How do they reproduce? And you have to do that with hundreds and hundreds of species because there are so many species in one place. In Barrow, Colorado Island, there's 450 tree species. That's more species than exists in, some estimates of the total diversity of tree species in Europe, right? In one small island, the size of Heathrow Airport. So that kind of diversity was the inspiration for large plot networks. And so we started at Barrow, Colorado Island, and now we've extended that through networks and collaborations all over the tropics and then all over the world to 78 different plots in 26 different countries, 27. And that was the basis of what's called forest geo. How do we understand the world's forests? And it's the same work, right? You put tape measures around trees, you measure them, you figure out their fates, you figure out the dynamics, the fundamentals of how forests are changing through time. It turns out what you're also measuring when you do that is carbon, right? Mm-hmm. Because in the forest, that is carbon. Trees are carbon, right? Trees are made of carbon. That's what makes the tropical forests home to 60+% of all the biomass carbon on the planet is in these tropical forests. Hugely important for understanding the future of carbon storage, right? So tropical forests are the most important ecosystem in terms of today. We know how to store carbon in forests better than any other ecosystem. It's pretty simple. You plant trees, right? And then they grow. It seems simple. It turns how you plant those trees and which species you plant and the rate at which they grow is actually a more complex problem than we thought. And one of the impediments that is keeping the investment we need from leaning in to create a future that is absorbing carbon, right? Let me just back up and say, let me just hit that one more time really quickly. Forests are the best understood natural carbon sink in the world, right? We know how to put carbon into them, and we know where it sits when it's there. It's all around you in the trees, right? And tropical forests have a higher density of carbon than any other forest type on the planet, significantly higher. So that if we're investing in pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, one of the very best ways to do that is to restore tropical forest landscapes around the world. And if you back up and ask, what are the status of forests in the world? It's about a third somewhat mature, somewhat intact forest, about a third heavily degraded, selectively logged forest, and about a third cattle pasture that could be forest, right? That's rough numbers around the world. And the rate of deforestation in tropical forests is 10 times that rate in any other forest type. So we're losing the highest density carbon stores on the planet 10 times faster than any other forest type, at a time when we're trying to reverse that trend and put carbon back into those ecosystems and out of the atmosphere. Why is that happening? Well, a big reason that's happening is because we're trying to fix this problem with philanthropy rather than with the private sector, right? In other words, if we want to work at that scale, you're going to need to get the economic engines of the world working for you, not against you. And how do you do that? You create stable markets around that actually incentivize people to plant trees. And it turns out those markets aren't too far away. The global forest carbon offset market is likely to be around $20 billion in 10 years. It's a big market. Sure. And yet the reason we don't see it taking off today and lots of capital going into really well-reasoned reforestation projects that actually consider who lives on land and what are the tenure issues around that and what are the biodiversity issues of reforesting. The reason that's not happening at scale is largely because there's too much risk in it right now. And the risk is there because we don't actually understand how to quantify the currency. That's carbon. That's the currency, right? If you can't quantify where it is and the rate at which it grows on a plot of land or the rate at which it leaves a plot of land, then a company could invest in what they think is a very good offset program to offset the things that they can't extract from their business cycle, say, fuel for their cars while they're trying to go to all electric. They can't invest in that without a risk of ending up at on the front page of the Guardian or the New York Times for investing in something that actually didn't help the planet. And no company wants to be seen doing that, right? And so a lot of that investment is pulled back and is waiting for stability in the marketplace. The reason that's important for science is that stability comes from understanding where carbon is in all forests, of all forest types in real time. And the only way we can do that is if we connect what we're doing from space with what we uniquely can do from the ground. So we've got satellites around the world looking down at Earth. We've got a number of space-based missions that have high resolution imagery that are being shot all the time on the state of the forest. But satellites can't see carbon, right? They can see the tops of trees. And so if you want to actually have a way of understanding carbon storage, what we call carbon flux, changes into and out of a forest, you need to translate what's being seen from space with detailed knowledge of what's happening on the ground. And the only way you do that is actually what we've been doing for 50 years, measuring trees on the ground in very high detail, even more detail than we've been doing in the past, but certainly starting from those collaborations that we've now established all over the world. So we formed this thing called GeoTrees with some fantastic partners so that we can establish plots, permanent plots in all forest types, in all forest conditions all over the world. And we think that'll take, about 300 plots to represent the world's forests. And you're like, wow, only 300 plots. It's a lot of forest. But you can extrapolate out with the right kind of technology from a plot to a landscape with some smaller plots around it. And so how this works is essentially in these 50-hectare plots or in these large landscapes, we can measure all the trees. And we can use that to understand, we can use some very fancy tools like laser scanning to figure out how much carbon is in every type of tree species on those plots. The more diverse the forest, the more difficult that task. So the tropics are the hardest place to quantify carbon, particularly mature forests in the tropics. It's where we are best as an institution, because it's where we have invested most over time. And it's our partners that do this all over the world. It's not a Smithsonian scientist in Malaysia. It's a Malaysian university scientist working with Smithsonian doing that in Malaysia. And so it's important that the only way this gets done is by large-scale networks of scientists working all over the world. So you can then use that knowledge connected with what's called Lidar, which is essentially laser scanning from above, from an airplane, to be able to understand large swaths of forest and how they relate to areas that you've sampled really intensively. And then you can use that information to communicate with satellites to tell them what they're seeing, right? So you're essentially creating an algorithm that tells satellites, when you see this spectrum, you're seeing this much carbon. And we know that because we can identify tree species, we can identify tree morphologies, we can use that to identify crown diameters, to link to trunk diameters, to carbon storage, to wood density, all the way down to understanding how much carbon is in that plot of land. If you can do that in real time, and you can communicate that to landowners and to investors, so that you could, what we call geofence, your land, and say, okay, I am going to do this to this land. I'm going to plant some trees. And then I can see, in time X, how much carbon is on that land, and in time Y, how much carbon is in that land. And it's verified and it's ratified and it's trusted the way in which we trust currency today. Then you can trade it. Then you can invest. Then you remove the risk from that landscape. And our role is simply to quantify where the carbon is. And it turns out that's what we've been doing for 50 years. We just didn't do it for that reason. And now we're doing it at scale around the world with partners, because our forest plot network is by far the largest in the world, but it doesn't cover all forest types. So we had to bring in groups like CRAD and groups that are studying secondary forest explicitly, because our plots were in primary forest, right? So we needed the degraded forest and we needed the secondary forest to really fill out that map. And that's what we're doing today. It's important that fantastic gift from Bezos Earth Fund, 12 million, it's about a $50 to $60 million project to do this. So they've given us a huge bunch of wind in our sails, and now we're working with them and others to raise the rest of the money. 60 million seems like a lot of money, but we spend billions every year on Earth system observation from the sky. We think of this as the fourth mission, the one mission you need on the ground to be able to make the most value out of those missions in space. And the one other thing I think is important about this project is, as we move forward, we know we're not only going to have to develop strong, robust carbon markets so that we can rapidly remove carbon from the earth. We're also going to have to get investing community and the private sector engaged in the preservation of biodiversity. And the only way you do that is also translating biodiversity into a market structure. And that's much harder than translating carbon, because it doesn't add up the way carbon does. It's not a molecule, right? You can't do an equivalency necessarily the way you do methane to carbon. You need to work much more carefully on what it is you're trying to measure and what's the value of biodiversity. And yet, I guarantee we're going to do it. We're going to do it with or without the science, because the investment community wants it. They're willing to pay for it. And so our job as scientists is to get out in front of that, so that whatever is developed with science, is developed in a way that actually helps the earth and doesn't have these weird unintended consequences. And so the same thing we use to understand carbon will be the basis for understanding broad-scale biodiversity patterns. Because once we can identify tree canopies of, the majority of the world's species from space, we'll be able to say something about changes in diversity of at least trees from space. And that's going to be really important as a baseline for articulating, even more like as an index that we will need to use to understand how diversity is changing in complex landscapes in real time for communities that need that real-time metric.
Mm-hmm.
Fundamentally, the markets don't slow down for science. They will work with or without the science that's at the table. And so the job of scientific communities is to get that science at the table so that it can have impact. And I think GeoTrees is our attempt to do some of that work. And I'm super excited about where it could go.
Yeah, absolutely. Continue along that theme for a moment when you're sort of connecting value and biodiversity, and then sort of looping back to something we discussed at the beginning when we were talking about chili peppers and capsaicin and all that. You have the genomics labs. We talked a little about synthetic biology when you were telling us the avian malaria story. I come out of the pharmaceutical industry, and my entire industry, for the 20th century, was built by novel natural products derived from some types of species, whether they plant, fungi, bacteria, whatever, living not just obviously in the Panamanian rainforest, but in all these unique ecosystems. I'd love to just get your thoughts on what's happening with what we call it, bioprospecting, or some other term. We had the International Cooperative Biodiversity thing with NIH back in the day, and how we could remunerate local populations. But the really smart people tell you, like, look, we've only scratched the surface with whether it's drugs or agricultural items, foods, whatever the case may be. There's a lot of other stuff out there that may be very valuable and useful for human health, well-being, whatever you want to say. Anything interesting, exciting going on the bioprospecting front? Is that something you get involved in at STRI? Okay.
It is. We absolutely get involved in I think so. So I think you're right. There is a huge amount of untapped value in the chemistry that has evolved over the last 4 billion years, that is contained to a large extent in the most diverse ecosystems on the planet, right? Which are rainforest, reefs, and other associated ecosystems. The trick is, and the evolution of bioprospecting has been really interesting to track. In other words, we spent a lot of time early on trying to just trying to sample large-scale sampling of potential natural products to try and understand what could be useful in doing trials.
Right.
Turns out it's hard to find. Right, there's a lot of chemistry in rainforest.
Oh yeah,
and it takes a lot of work to be able to build out libraries that way. So there's been some really interesting innovations in that space. One is to understand how plants use chemistry, or animals, and then look for specialized chemistry. Right, look where it actually evolves. So one example of that is you find specialized chemistry in places that is useful to humans to some extent, in places that plants have to specialize in their chemistry. So fruits, for example, have to be both tasty and protected, right? You gotta let something in to eat you, to move the seed from one place to another, but you need to protect yourself from other things. It turns out in fruits, you're usually protecting yourself from fungal pathogens, and you're usually trying to attract vertebrates. So that's an interesting place to look, because now we have a class of chemicals evolving in nature that are useful as antifungals, right? Because that's what capsaicin is, for example, hugely important antifungal agent. Likely one of the reasons why we domesticated chilies so early on in human history was because of the antimicrobial properties of chili peppers, same as onion and garlic and a bunch of others. And so let's use that today, right? Let's figure out what other things are out there in the rainforest that we can do that. There's a whole class of what are called secondary metabolites that plants use to defend against attack, basically. And so there's been work we're doing currently is actually working with partners in the private sector and university partners to understand if you can use theories of how those plant defense evolve to predict where you're going to find novel chemicals, right? So we can get much more surgical in where we should look. And that's, of course, in parallel to this exponential growth in our ability to both create synthetic compounds and be able to sort of predict the types of compounds that will have the types of impacts we're looking for, right? And so that reverse engineering in the lab and then figuring out where those kind of compounds are going to occur in nature and then testing them is an interesting back and forth conversation that we're involved in right now. And I guess the last piece around this is it's around intellectual property, right? So natural products, one of the things that I think is part of our ambition is that as we develop discoveries in rainforests of Panama that are that can help the pharmaceutical communities, that can help the innovation communities around the world, we have to recognize that intellectual property, has to come back to Panama in some ways, right? We've spent, we have a really strong colonial history of extraction from tropical nations around the world. Some of that extraction is knowledge. And so we partner with Indicasat and other national structures here in Panama to ensure that those kind of discoveries get developed more rapidly in Panama than they would otherwise, so that the Panamanian people can benefit from that as well as people around the world. And I think that's part of being a good partner, right? Is making sure that the innovation and the discovery that we're allowed to do here in Panama comes back to benefit the country.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's interesting because it's quite timely, actually, that just the other day I recorded an episode with Dr. Tom Metz. He's at the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory as part of our Department of Energy, but he's specifically working on these unique HPLC designs that, for lack of a better word, we don't in the grind and find process of yesteryear, we don't need as much stuff anymore, and that we can use a lot less. And I thought that it is an interesting connection there. So I'd love to see his technology sort of and the revitalization of natural products, because personally I think there's so much more out there.
I think there's a ton more out there, and you're going to find it in the most diverse parts of the planet and some of the most extreme parts of the planet, right? Because that's the other place you find really interesting chemistry, is in some of these really extreme places, whether it's hot springs or Arctic climates and such.
Right. Josh, what else is happening? Anything coming up for the remainder of 2023 that we should know about in terms of other conferences, talks you're going to be giving, events that you're going to be holding? Anything else that I didn't touch on, please take the floor.
Well, yeah, a couple of things. We also received a really generous donation from Adrian Arsht, who's been a fantastic philanthropist in Miami and in DC and elsewhere in the United States, to establish a center for resilience and sustainability at STRI. And so part of, I think, the future of our research institute here is impact, right? We've spent 50 or 60 years developing the very best science of the tropics in the tropics, and I am immensely proud of that history. And at this point, with the urgency we face in tropical nations to solve challenges today, whether it's blue carbon in mangroves or the future of tropical reefs or how reforestation supports the future of tropical rainforests, we need to build our knowledge into decision-making circles faster. We need to structure our research so that it can have impacts. And the conversation about geotrees is one example of that. I think that can have significant impacts to a really important marketplace that will help biodiversity if done correctly. It won't work unless we also understand how to support the reforestation that comes from that success, so that we don't end up with a whole bunch of land speculation and a bunch of teak and eucalyptus and pine planted all over the tropics. And so there's it just precipitates more scientific work that we also need to get out in front of, which we're doing through a project called Agua Salud. But I think part of the future of the organization is to support a broader range of collaborations that will allow our science to have greater impact in the nearer term, right? So linking with others, recognizing that we're not going to do everything ourselves, but we just hired our first, dedicated social scientist here at STRI, focusing on the communities around coastal communities in the tropics, because you can't use the knowledge of how coastal ecosystems work unless you understand how people that depend on those ecosystems also work. And that's a whole branch of science we need to embrace, social science, right? And we are increasingly building out structures that will allow us to connect our science to the world, not just at STRI, but at the whole Smithsonian. It's a big institutional push at this point called Life on a Sustainable Planet. And so we're engaging in things like the UNFC climate change, the COP28, and we're engaging in the biodiversity COPs, and we're thinking about climate, and we're going to be at Climate Week. And so we're just getting out into these ecosystems that don't involve just scientists. I've been talking at the Bloomberg New Economy conferences, because that's where business leaders connect. And I need those business leaders to understand the importance of biodiversity. I need them to see the importance of business practices that engage with climate change and think about the evolving markets and opportunities that are coming up from their perspective, so that we can plug our science more rapidly into that sector. That's going to be the future. Is science is going to have to roll up its sleeves, because we're in an all hands on deck moment. All of us have issues that we all have things to contribute to the sustainability of the planet. And I think particularly those that have deep knowledge about how that planet works, we've got to roll up our sleeves. We've got to be available to that broader community. And I think that's what I hope to see more and more of at STRI, along with the continued dedication to those those parts of the tangled bank that are hardest to untangle. And so the thing that I love about STRI more than anything else is that if you can sum up the ethos of STRI, it's that we go to the most complex parts of the tangled bank, and we do things that haven't been done there before. And that I think has to continue, and not just because it's super cool and fun research, but also because it's increasingly critically important research for the conservation of the world. So really excited to continue that journey.
That's awesome. Yeah, I'm rooting you on. It's
Thank you.
It's an amazing journey. I love hearing you talk about it with such passion. Just one last thing while I have you, I just have to ask: do you like spicy food, and do you have a favorite chili pepper?
Of course, I like spicy food, right?
All right.
You can't be a chili. I spent 10 years being the world's expert on why chili peppers are hot. I ate a ton of chili peppers. At one point, our lab was the place that people sent the hottest chili pepper to make sure it was actually the hottest chili pepper, and then I put them out in little dishes for grad students to try. And so, yeah, I love spicy food.
Awesome. Okay, I just want to make sure.
Yes, absolutely love spicy food, and it's great, and and there's still plenty of work to do in that system. If anyone wants to be diving into that system, there's lots.
I'll come down and work on that with you.
There you are.
Awesome stuff, Josh. I just, amazing story. Again, wishing you and the team there the best with all that you have going on and all these new initiatives. For everybody, again, that's going to be listening to this particular episode of our show across the various podcast networks or watching on the YouTube channel, you've been listening to Dr. Joshua Tewksbury, Ira Rubinoff, director of the Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute, doing really amazing things at the intersection of conservation, sustainability, biodiversity. Josh, again, thank you for taking the time out of your schedule to come talk to us for a little while. Obviously, thank you for everything you're doing for all of us and the planet. And as we like to say on our show, thanks for helping to create a better tomorrow for everybody via what you do. Really great story.
Ira, thank you for what you're doing. I can't say how much I appreciate the work that is being done by you and others like you to inspire people, right? It's about because this is all of our work, right? And I am an avid podcast listener, and I get up in the morning because I can see other people doing great work, and you help make that happen. So thank you.
Well, thank you for that.